Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to Campion Hall for our Campion lecture this Trinity term. I am Patrick Reardon, a Jesuit in this community, Senior Fellow for Political Philosophy and Catholic Social Thought, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you, those attending in person and those online, to this Campion lecture. Our distinguished speaker is Professor Paolo Carrozza, Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. His scholarly books and articles are primarily in the areas of comparative constitutional law and international human rights law, focusing particularly on foundational and structural principles of human rights law, such as human dignity and subsidiarity. For 10 years, he was director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame, where he also founded the Constitutionalism and Rule of Law Lab. He is a member of the Oversight Board, an independent expert body created by Meta to render decisions and policy recommendations regarding difficult moderation problems on Meta's platforms. From 2019 to 2023, he was a member of the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, and from 2006 to 2010, he was a member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and served as its president. He has also served on the American U.S. State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights and has been a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences since 2016. When he presented in last November to the Michaelmas Term Colloquium of the Institute for Ethics in AI, he spoke on the Meta Oversight Board and the self-regulation of tech companies. Professor Carrozza raised the question of the grounding of standards for self-regulation. He pointed to the danger of overlooking the centrality of the human person, the dignity of the person, which is at the heart of human rights discourse. So it is a great pleasure and my great delight to be able to welcome him to Campion Hall to speak to us today on developing human dignity in the digital age. Professor Carrozza, very welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Master, for the very kind invitation to speak here at Campion Hall. It's a great honor for me to deliver a lecture that bears the name of St. Edmund Campion. As I was reflecting both on his life and on my topic for this lecture, on the intersection of social media and Catholic social thought, I began to speculate about what it might be like for Campion to have lived with today's communications technologies. What if social media had been available in Campion's England? It's not difficult to see him as a consummate communicator, a prolific content generator, even an influencer with tens of thousands of Instagram followers. Even the Queen herself liked his posts at one point. No doubt he would employ technologies of amplification and reach, no less than he did the printing press, to produce and distribute his Decem Rationis and other pamphlets. And he might encode on his Facebook wall hints for his persecuted followers as to where his next clandestine mass would take place. One assumes he would take full advantage of the ease with which the virtual world allows one to assume fluid and fictitious identities. Just as he hid behind pseudonyms and disguises, he was Mr. Patrick while in Ireland, but a jewel merchant while returning to England for his mission. At the same time, of course, the technology would be in the hands of his hunters and persecutors as well. Presumably, the authorities would have geo-fenced the kingdom to keep out the ideas of all those nefarious Jesuits and enforced the takedown of whatever treasonous content got through their firewall. The Elizabethan surveillance state would have tracked him with facial recognition and powerful predictive algorithms, intercepted and cracked his encrypted signal messages, and harvested private data to profile and monitor potential sympathizers and collaborators. And in the end, Campion would undoubtedly have been martyred through the mass shaming and disinformation campaigns of troll farms, long before he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. Fanciful? Yes, of course. But not without a certain point as well. The contingencies of the material environment in which the church finds herself at any given time and place necessarily make a difference in how the faith is lived, and in the judgments needing to be made about the distinctive ethical challenges and opportunities of the time. New social, political, scientific, and technological contexts require existing teachings and doctrines, and the enduring but always mysterious relationship with reality that they seek to capture and communicate, to be filled in and extended, to take on new insights, to be given coherent shape again, and to be applied in new ways. This is certainly true of Catholic social doctrines and the myriad ways in which the advent of the digital information age interrogates them anew. Even this playfully absurd juxtaposition of Edmund Campion's mission and life with the technologies of the early 21st century highlights how drastically social media and the digital information ecosystem generally have altered the daily realities of our lives and our communities, of societal dynamics and political authority, of identity and self. Catholic social thought should have more than a few helpful insights to offer about those changes and how to understand them. It is, after all, a body of thought that directly and immediately aims to reflect on new dynamic social realities and to bring enduring principles to bear on them. Let's recall that the social doctrine of the Catholic Church was formally inaugurated with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, New Things, which sought to examine and respond to the social upheavals of the 19th century, industrialization and wage labor. The social transformations we are experiencing today are, to say the least, no less profound and pervasive than those. And yet, by and large, Catholic social teaching has not been keeping pace with the breadth and depth of these revolutionary shifts. I know of only one document issued by a Vatican office addressing social media, the Dicastery of Communications 2023 Pastoral Reflection, entitled Toward Full Presence. To be fair, it's probably impossible for any of us really to keep up with the speed and scale of technological change today. And even more so for the Catholic Church, a body accustomed to contemplating truths over centuries rather than to give a hot take in nanoseconds. And I do recognize that there are serious efforts underway to engage in deep philosophical and theological reflection from within the Catholic tradition on, for example, the implications of artificial intelligence. But relatively little of that reflection has made its way specifically into the Church's social teaching so far. And that absence is apparent in the area of social media and the online information ecosystem, notwithstanding the vital and thorny questions that they are generating daily. The need for a more comprehensive and sustained engagement with the new things of social media is evident across every core principle of Catholic social thought. May I have a... Thank you. Consider, for starters, the idea of the common good and the virtue of solidarity. Online platforms present us with a core paradox: simultaneous connection and division. On the one hand, they foster unprecedented linkages between persons, even on a global level. The presumptive promise that this connectivity might hold for the cultivation of solidarity among persons and for the recognition of a universal common good are remarkable. 20 years ago, it might not have seemed unreasonable to predict that the advent of the internet might contribute to a new flourishing of solidarity among individuals and communities around the world and the sharing of common human needs and a commitment to universal human values. 2 decades later, such techno-optimism seems naive at best. Along with enabling global connections, social media platforms often seem to be dissolving social bonds and contributing to a hyper-individualistic narcissism, or to a tribalism and polarization that are the corruption of solidarity understood as a genuine dedication to the good of others. What is the responsibility of massive global business entities for contributing to solidarity among individuals and communities? Actors steeped in the Catholic social tradition have been engaged for many decades in efforts to hold corporations accountable to the common good. What does that tradition, both in its theory and in its enactment, have to say about how social media platforms should curate their content? Or instead, consider how René Girard's insights into the dynamics of mimesis and scapegoating could be read as remarkably prescient of what we witness on a daily basis on social media platforms. He saw Christ's taking the place of the expiatory victim as the essential answer to that perpetual cycle of violence. How do we take that seriously in the face of phenomena such as mass shaming and collective bullying online? Or still further, consider the questions of authority, agency, and participation that arise due to the power and global penetration of social media companies. The principle of subsidiarity calls for decisions about the common good to be taken as much as possible at the levels closest to the persons most affected by them, to respect their agency and participation. And yet, social media's staggering scale, coupled with its uniform global standards, mostly created and directed from an exceedingly small number of geographic centers by rarefied elites, would appear to constitute a standing structural contradiction to subsidiarity. It tends to ignore local context and local realities in a grand sweep of homogenizing power. Should we therefore welcome or be suspicious of the current trend of fragmentation of internet governance among states and regions, and the emergence of the so-called splinternet? How can we structure authority and governance to help direct the awesome power of these technologies to the development of local communities, rather than to the usurpation of their communal freedom and self-governance, starting with the most basic unit of society, the family? A third area of concern might concentrate on what has been known in the Catholic social tradition as the universal destination of goods, and on the closely related principle of the preferential option for the poor. Here again, we see deep contradictions. The online information ecosystem creates hitherto unknown possibilities for the sharing of useful information. But it's, I think there's a page. Its underlying economic engine is largely powered by a surveillance capitalism that harvests and commodifies personal data. Similarly, we can see significant examples of social media being used by oppressed minorities to gain voice and visibility. But it has also been an instrument for inciting violence against them, inflaming hatred against disfavored and vulnerable populations, and literally fomenting genocide. And much good work is already being done by moral theologians like Maria Cahill and others on the discrimination and algorithmic bias that current uses of artificial intelligence can entrench in society. These questions and observations, and many more like them, we could go on all evening in this vein, all point in a common direction, toward the need for a more serious and comprehensive reflection on what Catholic social thought has to say to and learn from the new things of the digital information era. Together, they are an outline of what could be an entire research program. They also point all to a more general common concern at their root. often only implicit, but always inescapable. They all rest on the question of the essential value of the human person, on human dignity, which the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church identifies as, and I quote, the foundation of all the other principles and content of the Church's social doctrine. For the remainder of this talk, then, rather than try to range widely over the terrain of Catholic social teaching in general, I'll try to be a little bit more focused on how we might think about the intersection of human dignity, social media, and the online information ecosystem in general. That human dignity is critically important in this area is widely acknowledged, at least in law. For 3/4 of a century, it has been invoked with unwavering consistency in treaties and declarations as the foundation for internationally recognized human rights, starting with the 1948 Universal Declaration. Constitutional systems across widely diverse traditions declare their fealty to human dignity today. And most recently, the requirement that technologies from social media to artificial intelligence are required to respect and uphold human dignity has been making regular appearances in groundbreaking regulatory initiatives like the European Union's Digital Services Act and its AI Act, requiring explicitly that technology companies act in ways that respect and do not harm human dignity. Now, of course, that consensus around the centrality of dignity only exists at a very high level of generality, and it often evades or even masks substantive disagreements. The further specification of the general principle of human dignity in particular precepts or judicial decisions is often a matter of much more controversy, as, for instance, it is in the current debate over assisted suicide here in the United Kingdom, very evidently. And in many areas of ethics, the idea of human dignity is even more contested than in law, with some prominent thinkers going so far as to label the content useless, vacuous, stupid, or even dangerous. Many of them are in that book right there. Today, however, I propose to bypass those disagreements because they largely result from deeply divergent and partially irreconcilable first premises of philosophical anthropology. Instead, I'm interested in working here specifically within the tradition animating Catholic social thought, in which the underlying philosophical anthropology is rather more cohesive. The dignity of the human person in this tradition is the inestimable value or worth, dignitas, of each and every human being, simply in virtue of being created in the image of God. It is inherent, equal, and inalienable. Now, this is not to say that there aren't very difficult and important disagreements internally to the Catholic tradition about the exact basis and meaning of human dignity and about the implications of recognizing and respecting it in our social relations. The wide-ranging reactions and controversy elicited by the recent document on human dignity, issued just last month by the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, called Dignitas Infinita, have made that apparent. While commentators have squared off over Dignitas Infinita's application of dignity in the context of, for instance, gender and sexuality, surrogacy, or the death penalty, there has, however, been general praise for and little disagreement about the document's more general discussion of the basis and meaning of human dignity in Catholic thought more broadly. In any case, for my purposes here, the most intriguingly new part of that document comes almost at its close, in 2 paragraphs that, as far as I can tell, have attracted no attention whatsoever in the public punditry to date. At the end of a discussion of 13 distinct, what it calls grave violations of human dignity, ranging from the drama of poverty to human trafficking to the marginalization of people with disabilities, the declaration then turns, lastly, to the problem of what it calls digital violence. And I'll quote at length. Although the advancement of digital technologies may offer many possibilities for promoting human dignity, it also increasingly tends towards the creation of a world in which exploitation, exclusion, and violence grow, extending even to the point of harming the dignity of the human person. If technology is to serve human dignity and not harm it, and if it is to promote peace rather than violence, then the human community must be proactive in addressing these trends with respect to human dignity and the promotion of the good. Some of the more specific examples of harm referred to under this heading include fake news and slander, incitement of violence and cyberbullying, an environment of, quote, loneliness, manipulation, and exploitation, the risk of addiction, and the gradual loss of contact with concrete reality, blocking the development of authentic interpersonal relationships. Now, although it would not be entirely correct to say that this is the first example of a magisterial text commenting on the possibilities and dangers presented by online communication systems, after all, both the current Pope and his predecessor made a variety of passing remarks on the topic. It is one of the only ones to address the topic very directly, and the first to do so specifically and explicitly in relation to the broad Catholic understanding of human dignity. And thus it invites some very interesting new reflections. Passing through that open door and exploring the terrain on the other side of it requires us to build on a point made earlier. With regard to Catholic social thought more generally, as suggested, there is a host of ways in which its basic principles need to be brought to bear on the new realities arising out of social media and other new technologies. But that is not just a one-way street, applying a static concept or doctrine to a new situation. It may also be the case, and needs to be the case, that the principles themselves need further development in order to respond adequately to the new circumstances. Such is the case with our understanding of human dignity. Part of the challenge is that the way in which human dignity is articulated isn't sufficient to respond to the experiences we are living today. The new things of our digital era thus provoke us to examine, to bring out, to emphasize new dimensions of human dignity. As I'll try to illustrate in a moment, we are in an era where the meaning and value of what it means to be human is being questioned and threatened in absolutely unprecedented ways. And the understandings of dignity gained in a radically different time are not by themselves sufficient to ground an adequate response. In short, we need a development of dignity for the digital age. Let me be very quick to offer some qualifications to that statement, though, lest I be misunderstood. First, although I speak of developing dignity, what I really mean more precisely is developing our understanding of human dignity. That just didn't have as much of an alliterative ring, for purposes of a title, especially combined with digital. But the concept and language of dignity are sometimes used in different ways that are not entirely compatible with one another and can lead to contradictions and ambiguities. It is for that reason that the Declaration Dignitas Infinita begins with what it calls a fundamental clarification that distinguishes the concept of human dignity in its ontological sense from three other uses of that term. What it refers to as moral dignity, social dignity, and existential dignity. Dignity in the latter three senses can be gained or lost, subjectively felt or not, realized or damaged by the ways in which we exercise our own freedom or by the conditions of life imposed upon us. But as the Declaration affirms, the most important among these is the ontological dignity that belongs to the person as such simply because he or she exists and is willed, created, and loved by God. Ontological dignity, the quote continues, is indelible and remains valid beyond any circumstances in which the person may find themselves. That ontological sense is the one I refer to here. Still, even dignity in this timeless and enduring sense can be subject to our changing and deepening human capacity to grasp its meaning and its demands. To use an imperfect but suggestive metaphor, it's like coming to grasp the additional dimensions of space-time that string theory reveals to us. Space-time has not changed, but in the advancement of our scientific knowledge, both experimental and theoretical, our awareness of its dimensions has expanded from what were once 3 or 4 to 10 or 11 or even 26. Precisely because dignity refers to a God-granted quality of the human person that is, in the words of John Paul II, from which Dignitas Infinita takes its title, infinite, the number of dimensions to discover remains in some important way always inexhaustible. It is always a mystery to be plumbed further. Dignitas Infinita itself acknowledges this need for growth and change in our understanding of dignity, referring to the progress of humanity's reflection on the concept of dignity and noting that in history, the Church's magisterium progressively developed an ever greater understanding of the meaning of human dignity, along with its demands and consequences. Significantly, that development was not only the consequence of thinking outward from a set of a priori first principles of metaphysics or from revealed dogmas within the tradition, but also through the encounter and engagement with other perspectives outside of the tradition. The Declaration points, for example, to the contributions of Descartes and Kant and to 20th century philosophical investigations of personal subjectivity. Dignity is thus what John Henry Newman referred to as a living idea, an active principle leading minds to an ever new contemplation of itself and to an application of it in various directions. Perhaps the clearest example of how the Church's understanding of the dimensions and implications of human dignity have developed in time and in relationship with other sources of reflection upon it is expressed in the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, appropriately titled Dignitatis Humanae, to which I'll return in a few moments. Crucially, our understanding of human dignity is not developed only within the mind as an idea, but through our experience more broadly, by being enacted, by the practice of doing dignity. To borrow Ludwig Wittgenstein's exhortation when he spoke about the importance of being able to walk in practice, he says, quote, "We want to walk, so we need friction, back to the rough ground." If we want to walk forward with it, our theory and reflection regarding human dignity needs to be in constant contact with the rough ground of human experience. To do so, we need to regard real people who live dignity and indignity in concrete contexts, and not simply to look at them as if they were epistemic objects, that is, types of people who have been removed from those circumstances. This sort of reflection on experience was in fact instrumental to the Church's developing thought on religious freedom in the 20th century that culminated in Dignitatis Humanae. It is also worth emphasizing that throughout the long history of human rights, including the Church's engagement with human rights, going back at least to the 16th century, it has frequently been the case that the most important and influential revolutions in thought about the dignity of human persons have come about through wrestling with the impact of our experience of its violation. Whether in the conquest and subjugation of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, or the enslavement and commodification of Africans, or the genocide of Jews, or countless other examples of human dignity being eclipsed. Tragically, but apparently inescapably in the human condition, we often only become capable of recognizing more fully and universally the value of human beings through the witnessing of its denial. Today, this would mean observing and reflecting on human dignity today, not in the abstract, but in careful, attentive engagement, not only with the ways in which we can see human beings flourishing, but also how they're being oppressed and degraded by the new technologies that pervade their lives. There is no shortage today of situations in which the encounter between human beings and technology is palpably, visibly not conducive to their well-being. Let us begin reflecting there on how best to develop human dignity for the digital age. So after this long approach, finally, we can start to ask more specifically, what are some of the challenges to the distinctive value of the human person that are new today, or that are presented to us in newly acute ways as a result of the technology of online information and social media? I'd like to propose three areas not intended to be exhaustive, in which a more developed understanding of the meaning and scope and implications of human dignity could help us bring Catholic social thought to bear more cogently on these pressing challenges. I can only gesture in a general way toward them because both because of time and because the hard work is still to be done. So please consider the following a plea for further reflection more than a set of settled conclusions. First, and most importantly, in a world in which human relations are increasingly mediated by screens, avatars, we need to understand better how the meaning and value of our humanity is embodied. It cannot be abstracted from the integral unity of mind, body, and spirit. A view of the digital world and our place in it as a disembodied reality has been around as long as the internet itself, and has served as one of the cornerstones of a powerful strain of techno-utopian libertarianism in the tech world. One of the most iconic and enormously influential manifestos of this view was John Perry Barlow's 1996 Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. In it, Barlow, who, by the way, was a former cattle rancher and a lyricist for the Grateful Dead before founding the Electronic Frontier Foundation, announced this: "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. We are forming our own social contract. This governance will arise according to the conditions of our world, not yours. Our world is different. Ours is a world that is both everywhere and nowhere, but it is not where bodies live. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, context do not apply to us. They are based on matter. There is no matter here. Our identities have no bodies, so unlike you, we cannot obtain order by physical coercion. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before." It's a stirring declaration. No wonder it was so influential. In fact, it's astonishing how much the ideas announced in Barlow's declaration continue today to shape so much of the ideology of the online world, particularly with regard to the politics and law of the internet. While it is pitched primarily as a manifesto against governments, here, as always, politics and law reflect, at least implicitly, an underlying anthropological vision as well. Quote, "Our identities have no bodies," he says. "We will create a civilization of the mind." Elsewhere, he observed, "Cyberspace is something that happens independently of the physical world in exactly the same way as the mind and body." These are assertions of a deep denial of the essential embodiment of the human person, a pervasive mind-body dualism opposed to the human as an inescapably embodied bearer of human dignity. Like every reduction or fragmentation of the unity of reality, the ideology that it breeds leads eventually to forms of human disintegration. Friends without friendship, politics without community, sexuality without self-giving love, identity without belonging, expression without communication, experience without meaning. 24 years later, Barlow's boast that a disembodied world would prove to be more humane and fair seems not just erroneous, but a cruel lie. To point to a tangible example, consider the exploding epidemic of mental health, especially since the COVID pandemic, which itself catalyzed a massive social experiment in disembodied life, the negative effects of which we're only beginning to understand still. But even before the pandemic, internet-induced mental health problems were widely reported, especially among adolescents. Facebook's own leaked internal research concluded that, quote, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls." Jean Twenge's 2020 research suggested that substantial and sudden increases in youth rates of depression, self-harm, and suicide, especially among adolescent girls, were closely related to increased uses of technology. Building on that work, most recently, Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, argues that there's a strong connection between mobile phones and adverse teen psychosocial development and educational outcomes. That argument has resonated deeply with parents and educators, even while the conclusions of research on mental health and online life are being hotly debated in the language and conceptual apparatus of the social sciences. Causation versus correlation, regressions and p-values, confounding variables, all that is good and necessary for us to arrive at the best understandings of reality that we can, to be sure. But wouldn't we also be helped in our understanding by developing the language and conceptual resources to debate the causes of these problems in what we can affirm about human dignity? Simply to say we have equal, inherent, inalienable worth as human beings qua human is true, it's a start, but it's not enough. Dignitas Infinita, again, provides some useful hints and references as starting points for developing further the relationship between embodiment and dignity. Drawing on what it calls the classical definition of a person as an individual substance of a rational nature, the document then clarifies that the term rational encompasses all the capacities of the human person, including the capacities of knowing and understanding, as well as those of wanting, loving, choosing, and desiring. And it also includes all corporeal functions closely related to these abilities. And tellingly, every one of the 13 grave harms to human dignity that the document goes on to discuss in more detail are of inescapably embodied beings, whose dignity is both honored and violated in embodied forms. A second way in which we would profit from developing our understanding of human dignity is by returning to and re-examining the centrality of individual agency and freedom to human dignity. Now, that may seem strange to say, because, of course, this is, in an important sense, not new ground at all. In fact, the nature and scope of individual freedom is arguably the most discussed dimension of dignity in the contemporary world. In part, on the one hand, because it is a point on which different intellectual traditions overlap to a meaningful degree, but conversely also because it is a point on which the different anthropologies undergirding those traditions are their most irreconcilable. Consider, for instance, the arguments on both sides regarding dignity and autonomy in the spheres of bioethics, drug use, or sex work, for example. There is nevertheless an aspect of the discussion that is in need of further reflection as a result of the distinctive ways in which algorithms and machines affect human reason and freedom, and thus human dignity. The power of algorithms that process massive amounts of data for us open vistas of immense benefit to humanity, for the discovery of new medicines, for example. But most often, their essential purpose is to offload the need to make decisions from human beings to machines. Even the algorithms as simple as those driving the recommendation and amplification or demotion systems of social media platforms, and I use the word simple advisedly here, are essentially intended as means to obviate the need for human beings to weigh information and to exercise judgment, to decide what to prioritize, what to pay attention to, what to notice, what to disregard, what to read or watch, what to elevate, and what to discard. Put even more starkly, but not at all unrealistically, they are designed and intended to be, exceptionally powerful ways to capture our attention, steer our desires and aversions, and thus shape our ways of knowing. Already a dozen years ago, Pope Benedict XVI sounded a warning about how social media can depersonalize people through manipulation. But we should not be concerned solely about the direct and darker forms of manipulation technologies. Subtly, but maybe even more importantly, even in their more benign and constructive uses, they have long-term effects on the human capacities of reason and judgment and decision that we exercise. As the American philosopher Jeffrey Bishop has reminded us, this dynamic is true of artificial intelligence in the same way that it has historically been true of any tools that human beings have used. To use a tool is also to be altered by it. Thus, the advent and use of the printing press and the printed word led to enormous changes in traditions and capacities for orality, for oral memory, the preservation and transmission of knowledge through the spoken word. Today, research shows persuasively that the prevalence of GPS-based navigation systems, which so many of us use even multiple times a day, is leading to a decisive atrophy of people's ability to orient themselves spatially and directionally. What then shall we expect to be the effect of the rise of algorithmic reason and the offloading of human decisions onto machines, on human reason, judgment, the desire for meaning, and thus the genuine freedom to make choices? This is the dimension of dignity as agency that I am suggesting is at stake today in an unprecedented way. Michael Hanby has articulated well the ultimate endpoint to which that path could lead if followed heedlessly. And I'd like to read you a long quotation of his. The dawning age of artificial intelligence signifies a reconfiguration of the meaning of intellect and the emptying of intelligence itself of the very quality that once defined it and determined the goal and destiny of Western humanity, the capacity to apprehend and contemplate the true meaning of things. These astonishing feats of human power are also radically disempowering, minimizing human agency, often to the point of neutralizing it altogether, and offloading human functions onto complex systems that exercise causality without responsibility, emptying us, in the process, of the capacities that heretofore distinguished us as human and signified the presence of the imago Dei in us. Again, the resources of the Catholic social tradition for fortifying the dimensions of dignity having to do with the human capacity for reason, judgment, and meaning are not entirely absent. Going back to Dignitatis Humanae now, which I mentioned earlier, and which remains the Church's most profound and comprehensive reflection on the meaning and implications of human dignity, it links together, quote, the dignity of the human intellect in its orientation to the truth, of human freedom in the orientation to what is good, and the dignity of conscience as elements of human dignity, as Campion Hall's own Patrick Reardon recently pointed out in his book. We have perhaps underappreciated that interrelationship of conscience to freedom in our understanding of dignity. And it could be one starting point for coming to terms with the way human dignity is affected by the algorithmic society and what responses to it may be discerned through a deeper understanding of what all the dimensions of human dignity require. By way of comparison, I would note that as global norms against torture emerged more clearly and universally in the 20th century, some Catholic commentary on the prohibition, in contrast to most of the conventional literature of the time, focused not on the infliction of physical pain that torture entails, but rather on the ways in which it is directly intended to corrupt and destroy the free will, subjectivity, and agency of its victims. In the same vein, we should be more attentive not just to the downstream harms to persons that social media and artificial intelligence might bring about, but to the upstream question of how algorithmic reason can compromise human dignity by manipulating the human conscience and causing the atrophy of the human capacity for desire, judgment, and freedom. Third, and finally, there are certain specific human rights at issue in this area today that need a new and more persuasive grounding in a thicker understanding of human dignity if they are going to continue to be coherent and to protect fundamental human interests in the digital age. The modern evolution of the Catholic Church's acceptance and endorsement of the idea of universal human rights, and especially the right to freedom of religion, is instructive once again. Between the mid-19th century and the late 20th century, the Church's magisterial teaching went from a posture primarily of skepticism and hostility to the idea of the rights of man in general, and particularly freedom of religion, to being one of the most adamant and consistent advocates of the primary importance of freedom of religion on a global scale. Now, that transformation is, of course, very complex. Much ink has been spilled to explain and justify or even contest it. But even if there were other important factors at work, one of the decisive elements was the grounding of freedom of religion not in a relativistic abandonment of truth claims, but instead in a much more robust understanding of human dignity that emphasized the value of the human person being linked inextricably to his or her search for and adherence to truth in freedom. As again, the earlier quote from Patrick Reardon about the key elements of human dignity highlighted for us. Thus, with Dignitatis Humanae in 1965, what had been condemned in no uncertain terms a century earlier was able to be understood in a new way and embraced as the preeminent human right through the development of the link between religious freedom and human dignity, now more broadly understood. In the digital age, a comparable development needs to take place with regard to certain other human rights. Arguably, the whole idea of human rights is increasingly in crisis, and Dignitas Infinita rightly takes pains to affirm that in Catholic social thought, a proper understanding of human dignity is the foundation for all human rights and duties generally. But for our purposes here, two of the most classic entries in the canon of human rights, especially, are in need of a better and more coherent grounding in a thicker conception of dignity, if they are to maintain a meaningful place in the digital age. And those are the right to freedom of expression and the right to privacy. In the social media space, freedom of expression is the framing principle with which nearly every other norm somehow relates. And yet, its justification is wildly variable and uncertain. Is the right to freedom of expression merely a consequence of respect for an individual's expressive autonomy? Or is it to be viewed primarily in a relational lens, as a right with an inherently interpersonal configuration? Or even as having a broadly social and political telos, above all? The differences in understanding its basis can be enormously important in determining the proper scope of its recognition and protection. For example, when we are grappling with a speech that others might find objectionable, or that is objectively false. In general, I think it's fair to say that as a direct consequence of some of the pathologies of online speech, freedom of expression is under tremendous pressure everywhere, even in the United States, where it has always had a special and perhaps even exaggerated constitutional importance. Beyond listing it among the rights that should be recognized and respected, and despite its close relationship to freedom of religion, the right to freedom of expression has not really been theorized at all in Catholic social teaching. What is the human good served by protecting freedom of expression? What relationship does it have with respecting the dignity and destiny of the human person? What are its legitimate boundaries in relationship to other aspects of the common good? the rights of others, the due requirements of peace, the responsibilities that are reciprocal to rights? Can our developing understanding of human dignity take us deeper than the conventionally dominant but unsatisfying frames of reference of personal autonomy and political utility to an understanding of the human person as a being essentially constituted by the word, as a relational being whose dignity is realized and expressed in communicative exchanges, and as a being for whom freedom of expression, including the freedom to receive information through the expression of others, is essential to his or her discovery of and adherence to the truth, just as with freedom of religion. This would explain as well why disagreement and pluralism of viewpoints, why it's imperative to maintain a wide tolerance for error and disagreement and pluralism of viewpoints as well. While all that conceptual work is still to be done, I'm already convinced that a more fully dignitarian understanding of freedom of expression in Catholic social thought can help provide critical support for freedom of expression and better guidance for its use and its limits in the digital era and in relation to social media. Finally, and very briefly, a parallel argument is to be made around the right to privacy. On the one hand, the notion of privacy, especially in European human rights law, it has to be said, has come today to embrace such a broadly expansive set of interests and desires as to be the most prolific generator of new rights claims that seem to have nothing in common among them except ever more extensive assertions of personal autonomy. On the other hand, though, the threats to privacy that arise from the economic and political interests in harvesting data and monitoring every detail of our lives are severe and increasing. Thanks to social media, the dissolution of any meaningful sense of privacy seeps into everyday social relations as well. In his encyclical on social solidarity, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis pointed out that, quote, digital communication wants to bring everything out into the open. People's lives are combed over, laid bare, and bandied about, often anonymously. Respect for others disintegrates, and even as we dismiss, ignore, or keep others distant, we can shamelessly peer into every detail of their lives. Yet, in order for us to really articulate why the right to privacy merits special acknowledgement and protection, we need to be able to speak more carefully about how the human person's dignity is related to the capacity for an interior life, to having an inviolable space of intimacy, and to not having his or her personal information and identity harvested and commodified and instrumentalized by powerful interests. It is the other side of the coin of freedom of expression as well. The genuine encounter of one person with another, a favorite theme of the current Pope, requires both the integrity and intimacy of an I and the communicative openness of that I with a you. As in the case of freedom of expression, Catholic social thought and teaching has not delved into these essentially dignitarian dimensions of privacy. But the tradition does have a load of insight and experience to be mined to help us develop them. So I'd like to conclude by emphasizing that, notwithstanding all of my criticisms tonight of the environment of social media throughout the talk and the perils for human dignity that they pose, none of this is intended as a crusade against technology as such. Technology in the service of the human is a great gift and can be a great, powerful force for good in the world. And in any case, it is an inevitable part of the human landscape of our reality now and into the future, just as it has always been in the past. As long ago as 1951, Romano Guardini made a prophetic judgment about the technological age in which we now find ourselves. He said, quote, "The future epoch will not have to deal with the problem of the increase of power. even if it increases continuously and at an ever-accelerating rate, but with that of its domination. The central meaning of this epoch will be the duty to order power in such a way that the person making use of it can remain a person. Ordering power towards the human person involves orienting our laws and politics. How to do so well is consequential in both senses of that word. It's a question of enormous consequence, yes, but also something that must be a consequence of something else that precedes our law and politics. Ontology comes before ethics. However we might orient our laws in their details, it's impossible for us to expect that technology will advance the flourishing rather than the degradation of the human person if we don't become more capable of persuasively articulating what it means to be human, what it means for human life to be valuable, what it means to honor human dignity. We're living in a time when what it means to be human has never been more unclear and confused, and even explicitly rejected by some in anticipation of the triumph of a transhuman future. It brings to mind for me the lines from T.S. Eliot's Choruses from the Rock, when he speaks of a time when, quote, "It seems that something has happened that has never happened before, though we know not just when or why or how or where. Men have left God not for other gods, they say, but for no God." Except that we might say instead, something has happened that has never happened before. We've abandoned the human person not for another humanity, but for no humanity. Catholic social thought can have a vital, constructive role to play in bringing us back from the edge of that abyss, and not only for or among Catholics, through the development of its distinctive orientation towards the human dignity of embodied and free subjects in authentic communicative relationships with one another. Thank you.
So as to allow Paolo to have a moment to catch his breath, let me just say a word about this book to which he referred. Understanding Human Dignity was produced in 2013, arising out of a conference we both attended 2012. And that was a response to Pope Benedict's visit in London, where he spoke so movingly in Westminster Hall about human rights rooted in human dignity and human liberty rooted in human dignity. And arising out of that was the interest of the Church, Catholic Church, and academics to get together and make this a topic of discussion, understanding human dignity. I read your paper again this morning in preparation for today, and it is alive and as interesting as ever because it is pointing to human experience as that ground where we encounter one another as human, where our dignity is violated, but also where it is realized. A very beautiful contrast between a visit you described to a prison where people are living in abysmal circumstances, and then in the same town going to a home where AIDS patients and also severely handicapped children were being cared for lovingly by brothers. And that contrast in the experience of where human dignity is recognized and where it is violated, very moving indeed, and still very much your message that you've shared with us tonight. So now we have some time for questions or comments. Over to you.
And do you want the mic?
And I'll go with the mic, yes. Sorry. If you'd be to introduce yourself and say who you are. Were you asking? Yes.
I'm Richard. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Richard Seabohm, a Quaker, and I'm incredibly grateful for this talk because we are at a sort of opposite theological end of the Christian spectrum to the Catholic Church. But everything you've said rings absolutely true for us, and in particular, talking about children as being children of God, people being children of God, and one of our catchphrases is walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. And it is the people-to-people thing that is so important. And one of the oddities of the digital age is that young people lose the opportunity, the capacity for small talk, for the conversation with each other, which gets them to know something about what each other is like. But anyway, more power. I wish you well with further promotion of what you have said.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for your observation. In particular because of the way that it really brings out, this talk obviously was intended to be a talk about the Catholic tradition and within the Catholic tradition. But for the plea which I'm making to succeed in fact, right, there has to be this work being done across a variety of different traditions in dialogue with one another, right? Because otherwise we have no chance.
Emilio Subieco, I'm DPhil in theology here in Campion Hall. Thank you for your talk, very interesting. I would like to hear your opinion about how these aspects are connected to globalization. Because in my opinion, globalization initially was meant to be more comprehensive, including more and more opinions and more traditions from many different cultures, but it's becoming something that is in the power of very few people, and this is particularly evident in the use of social media and all these new technologies that is a lot of power in very few hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean the question of forms of globalization is very, very much in the background here, and perhaps my passing comments on subsidiarity and localism will have already tipped my hand in it, because as someone who has spent 4 decades, committed to principles of universal human rights and to defending and trying to bring out a variety of aspects of the Catholic Church's engagement with that tradition, and at one level, I'm by necessity a committed globalist in that sense of universal values, and yet. I've always been convinced that the form of globalism which is going to serve the human being and not work against the human being is one that can't erase the necessity of local communities, right? Of the communities where we belong. There will never be a single global polity that is adequate to the measure of the human person. And so I think the only alternative is a globalism that is a unity and encounter of different communities that themselves have a certain kind of integrity at the level of a more physical relationship, right? So whatever analogy you want to use, I mean, a form of a federated globalism as opposed to a global state would be a political analogy, right? But exactly the problem that so much of the forces of information technology today are pushing today is a kind of globalism that divorces it completely from that materiality of physical, local relationships, working against families and their unity, working against local communities and their distinctiveness. And that's the problem. So I do want to see globalism. I don't think globalism in general is in principle opposed to a greater and more human form of living together in solidarity. After all, for many years, the Church has affirmed the existence in principle of a universal common good, not just a local common good. But it can't be a globalism that is at the expense of the reality of the local communities in which our identities are formed and shaped and lived and in which we love.
Hi, my name is Simone Delson. I'm a DPhil in anthropology at Blackfriars. I'm from Trinidad, and I actually used some of your earlier writings to lead a discussion group in the Caribbean some years ago, and it took off. Everyone really loved it, and so it's such an honor to be here these years later. I am wondering about your thoughts on womanhood, because you mentioned the need for us to return to embodiment as a fundamental aspect of humanity, and you keep a recurring theme throughout your address is the concrete, the local, and of course embodiment. So what do you see as the role of womanhood and how society addresses womanhood in a return to human dignity or an enlivening of human dignity?
Oh, wow, thank you. I'm so glad you raised that question. Although not because I have an answer to it, but because the opposite, right? Because I can immediately recognize the importance and centrality of that question, right? But I'm not equipped to begin to answer it, right? And not simply because I'm not a woman, but because I've not, sort of listened and read and been in dialogue with sort of what it might mean as a woman to be and have an embodied dignity, and how that might be distinctive. Now, what I will say that I think is more generally necessarily true is has a lot to do with the answer to the previous question, right? Which is dignity generally, and an embodied form of dignity and affirming it does not mean that we're all going to live it in the same way and experience it in the same way. And so the differences of what it will mean will vary across. I mean, this is what I meant about sort of not treating people as epistemic types here, right? But seeing them in the specificity of where they're located, who they are, their identities, who they're related to. The entire question that you, as someone in anthropology, would be centrally concerned with about where the systems of meaning are generated, right, for them. A lot to do with how a body is related to a mind concretely is not something that can be abstracted from those environments, right? And so we need to go and to listen humbly, which it doesn't happen enough, right? And that's true of listening to the distinctive experience of women, as well as the distinctive experiences of people who live in all different kinds of contexts and situations in the world. Hello, Severine.
I am Séverine Dedelin. I am the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall. Thank you very much for this really wonderful overview and very bold research in a very underexplored area. One thing that you didn't mention, but which is quite central to digital media and technology, is the amount of energy that it requires. Now, all these algorithms, it requires these massive computers that rely on electricity and constant energy, and not to mention the e-waste, all the mobile phones, the computers that we have. So could there be an argument as well from an ecological perspective, not only of the human dignity, but the dignity of creation, of all what this digital age is creating to our planet? It's not sustainable for ourselves as humans, but also not sustainable for our common home,
Yes.
for the life that sustains us.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you, Severine, and thank you for coming. It's so good to see you here, and always to learn from you. Including on this point, I agree entirely. I made a point of saying these weren't exhaustive of the kinds of questions that should be raised in this area. I do think that to the extent that it implicates human dignity, it does so in a less direct way than the things that I did identify. But that doesn't mean it's less important in general. And I would point out, another point of Dignitas Infinita that I thought was interestingly provocative and worth going back to, and clearly was learned from the teaching of Francis regarding our relationship with creation and the gift of creation, was a comment right towards the beginning of the document where it says, I'm just obviously paraphrasing, I'm not going to remember the exact words, but it points out, look, any discussion of dignity has to acknowledge the anthropocentrism of the discussion, right? Which today is more problematic than it has been in many ways. To say human beings are special, in part exactly because of our greater awareness of what we're doing, and the way that of our relationship with the rest of creation. And the way that the Dignitas Infinita phrases it, borrowing from Francis, is that we need what it calls a situated anthropocentrism that situates us in the context of the different kind of dignity of all that creation has, and how to respect that. So that document itself does make the link there, and I think it is a link worth exploring, most definitely. I would say even more broadly that does highlight, I think, that some of the other work that I've been reading and pondering outside of the Catholic tradition that struggles with dignity, struggles exactly with almost an embarrassment of the idea that human beings might somehow be distinctive from any other kind of creation, right? And so in order to rescue human dignity in a meaningful way here and avoid that temptation of just saying, well, we're going to set it aside altogether because we don't want to be different, and yet also acknowledge fully our relationship with all of the creation and our responsibility toward it. I think something like, whether you use the term or not, something like this situated anthropocentrism and its relationship to dignity is a really interesting and important idea to develop.
I'm Nick Austin, Fellow in Theological Ethics at Campion Hall, so many thanks for a very compelling talk, Professor Paolo. I very much appreciated your method of what you might call the contrast experiences of human dignity, where we see that dignity is not upheld or respected through in the digital world. I suppose my question concerns the idea of a positive ethic of upholding human dignity. There was a slight hint of defensiveness at the end when you said, "No, I'm not engaging in a crusade. This isn't moralism. It's not saying all technology is bad." Now, you've used the language, obviously, human dignity is very closely connected, as you've said, to the language of human rights. But you also said that there are correlation, that you need the correlation of the responsibilities and the duties correlative to human rights. So my question is not, should we dispense of the language of human rights and so on, but rather, what other moral languages do we need to complement the language of rights to develop this positive ethic of upholding human dignity in the digital world?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Master. So in some ways, this is a little hard for me to say publicly as someone so immersed in the human rights world. But one of the things that I've come to be convinced of, and even more so now that I'm working at this intersection of human rights and social media, concretely in the decisions that I'm called to make at the oversight board, for example, on a regular basis, is that it is, I think, regrettable that the language and the discourse and apparatus and institutions of law of human rights have so completely taken over this area. Human rights are essential. They're important. I wouldn't discard them, but they're limited, and they're not. They don't comprehend the way in which we should articulate the good. In the first instance, because they're so sort of blind in the way that they're used to the fact that they don't even exist without duties that are reciprocal to them. But also then, as you suggest, that if human dignity is what we say it is, and we claim it to be, then it makes all sorts of demands on us in terms of respecting others, or the sort of public responsibilities that I have simply by virtue of having a certain kind of power, right, to affect the common good, which is what social media companies have. So we don't have today, I've become convinced, an adequate, let alone shared, understanding of where to ground the duties of tech companies towards the public sphere and towards other people, in part because the language of human rights is inadequate for capturing it, right? Now, that only partially answers your question. I mean, really, I'm just saying I agree with the question, and to the extent that I can elaborate it a little bit. But I think it's absent. Now, I'm not a philosopher or an ethicist, notwithstanding, my playing with certain philosophical language here. And so I'm looking at you.
One final short question.
Thank you. I'm an MPhil student in theology at Blackfriars Hall as well. And one question was kind of taken by Severin on the situated anthropocentrism. And the way you said it wasn't directly applicable to the digital thing. Could you give us a bit more of reflection? You chose the body, mind, spirit unity, and it could have been body, mind, spirit, and beyond. So there must be questions specifically raised for the digital and the way we embody digital nature and technique, how those relate. Or maybe if you haven't made those reflections yet, why? Obviously, we're limited in the 3 points. But it seems a very natural step for me to go from there to the integral ecology.
Yeah, no, I think it is. As I said to Severin, and I repeat, I would love to see greater reflection on that. I haven't done it myself. It's not the tradition that's not the scholarly trajectory that I've been on, and so not the ideas I've worked with for 20 years in any significant way. When I was directing a research institute at which Severin very, very kindly came and visited and did work, I profited from the work that she and others did in that area, but it wasn't my own. But I think more importantly, the reason that I haven't gone there yet, notwithstanding a recognition of its importance, is precisely because of this method of sort of working from where I witness on a daily basis the kinds of threats, right? In the discourse that so 2 years ago, I didn't work on technology issues at all, okay? It's been sort of a 2-year immersion in something completely new, okay? Which on the one hand, at my age is kind of a nice, fun, and exciting thing, but more than that, it's kind of arresting to be such a neophyte again in an area. And so a lot of what I was doing is simply soaking things in, listening, trying to learn as many different voices as possible, trying to get in a sense of what is the epistemic community that I've become a part of here by entering this. And what I kept hearing, whether the words were used or not, is a separation of the body from the mind, right? The kind of dualism that I, in a certain sense, grew up aware of when I first began in any way to be aware of it in relationship to my sort of Catholic formation was a dualism that, in a certain sense, exalted the body and the material. And instead, what I found myself is confronted every day now with the kind of dualism that discards materiality, right? And exalts this sort of abstraction of a human being as not existing in the material space in any real way. And so it's largely just because of a reaction to that experience that I've had.
Paolo, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. One of the things you should know is that here at Campion Hall, we've taken as a theme to guide our work and research the humanum, the human person and human dignity. And you have given us such a wonderful, agenda to continue that forward with some inspiration and encouragement. It's been really wonderful to hear your presentation and to take away these very stimulating thoughts. Many people still have questions, I know, but we will stop now and have some refreshing drink. We can take that into the garden if we wish, so people will have an opportunity to speak to Paolo personally. But please let us show him our gratitude for what we have heard. Really wonderful, wonderful. So please help yourself to some drink at the back.